Thanks for tuning in to Crazy Mango Stories. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for more betrayal stories. Michael had been on the road for nearly a week, away on yet another business trip. It was late by the time his plane landed, and exhaustion clung to him like a second skin. All he wanted was to slide into bed next to Jennifer, maybe even wrap her in his arms and let the stress of the day melt away. But as he turned the corner to his quiet suburban street, something yanked him out of his tired fog. An unfamiliar car sat parked in his driveway. His heart hammered in his chest. He slowed down, headlights briefly illuminating the sleek black vehicle. It wasn't a neighbor's car, and it damn sure wasn't his. Instinctively, he cut the engine down the street, parking his own car a few houses away. Michael knew that gut feeling too well. The weight in his stomach was like the one he'd felt twice before, the same feeling that led him to uncover her first two affairs. Jennifer had made promises after each one, swore on everything that she loved him and would never hurt him again. But now, as he eyed the car in his driveway, something inside him snapped. His mind raced with ugly thoughts. Another one. Had she found another fool to crawl between their sheets? Clenching his fists, he quietly approached the house, the soft gravel underfoot amplifying the slow surge of his anger. The house was eerily quiet as he slipped inside. The living room was dark, but there were muffled voices coming from upstairs. His bedroom. And Michael didn't storm in. Not yet, that wasn't his way. His rage was cold, calculating. But he wasn't the man he used to be. The first time Jennifer had cheated, he had wept, shouted, begged. The second time he had broken down inside but dealt with her lover, privately paid him off, and made him vanish. But this time there would be no mercy. He moved through the house like a shadow, each step deliberate, every creak of the floorboard reminding him of just how close he was to unraveling everything. His patience had worn thin. His calm exterior belied the violence simmering beneath. This time, things were going to be different. Reaching the foot of the stairs, Michael paused. The voices upstairs had become more distinct. Jennifer's unmistakable soft laugh mingled with a man's low voice. His mind flared with vicious plans, thinking about how he would ruin not just her but him as well. He wouldn't be paying off this one. No, this third man would be made to suffer. And Michael glanced down at his hands, cracking his knuckles. He had done enough talking in the past. Now he was ready for something more brutal. Michael stood at the base of the stairs, fists clenched, listening to the soft murmur of voices drifting down from the bedroom. His wife's voice, once a melody that used to bring him comfort, now felt like a blade slicing through his composure. The man's voice was low, confident. It was infuriating. A stranger in his house, in his bed. The dark hallway stretched in front of him, but it wasn't darkness he felt. No, what flooded him now was a cold, calculating fury. The same rage he tried to bottle after her first betrayal. The same fury that almost destroyed him the second time. Now it surged back with a vengeance stronger than ever. This was strike three, and she crossed a line she couldn't uncross. He slid his hand along the railing, the wood creaking beneath his fingers. Every creak, every muffled laugh from upstairs only hardened his resolve. He wasn't going to burst in, fists flying. He wasn't going to shout or plead or demand answers. Not this time. This time he wanted to savor every second of their undoing. He had learned from the previous betrayals, had grown colder, more patient. Now there was a plan forming, a need to make them suffer in ways they couldn't imagine. Michael took one deliberate step, then another, moving as silently as a predator closing in on prey. The house was familiar, every squeaky floorboard and corner etched into his mind. He had lived here for years. After all, this was his territory. The trespasser upstairs was about to learn that the hard way. As he reached the top of the stairs, his eyes flicked to the slightly ajar bedroom door. A soft yellow light seeped through the crack, and the voices were clearer now. Jennifer's sweet laughter, her voice full of the same affection she used to save for him. The man's voice followed, low and intimate, as though he had the right to be comfortable in Michael's home. But Michael's hand itched to push the door open, to catch them in the act, but he restrained himself. He wanted to watch, to know the full extent of their betrayal before he made his move. With careful steps, he moved closer, stopping just outside the door, his heart pounding like a war drum in his chest. That he could see through the small crack Jennifer's bare back, her skin glistening under the dim light, her head resting on some stranger's chest. The man lay there, arrogant, smiling down at her like he had won something. Michael's teeth ground together, his jaw clenching so hard it hurt. The image burned into his mind, Jennifer, his wife, wrapped around another man, the sheets twisted beneath them. They looked comfortable, like this was routine, like he was the intruder in his own life. His pulse raced, the fury climbing higher, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had waited this long. He could wait a little longer, just a little more. He stepped back into the hallway, inhaling deeply, letting the quiet moment of realization soak in. That his patience had its limits, but the payoff would be worth it. They had no idea he was there, watching, listening. That was his advantage. Michael's mind raced with possibilities, what to do, how to ruin them both. But this man, this third lover, would face something much worse than just humiliation. The others had gotten off too easily. Not this one. He was going to make sure that neither Jennifer nor this nameless fool would ever forget him. Michael turned, his mind made up. This was no longer about simply catching them in the act. This was about revenge, cold, brutal revenge, and it was going to be spectacular. Michael walked back down the stairs, every step measured and deliberate. His mind raced as he pieced together what would come next. The betrayal was clear, but he wasn't going to rush into it. No, this was going to be slow. So it was going to hurt not just physically, but deep down in their souls. They thought they could do this in his house, to mock his life. He would show them both exactly how wrong they were. He moved to the kitchen and opened the drawer where he kept a small utility knife, sharp, unassuming, but effective. He ran his thumb along the blade, feeling its cool edge. It wasn't going to be used for anything as dramatic as slicing throats, no. Michael had something far more personal in mind. He placed the knife back on the counter, his hand lingering on it for a moment before turning away. From the living room, he could still hear the low murmur of their voices upstairs. That sound, that intimacy had always been his. He had built a life with Jennifer, a life he thought they were both invested in. And yet, here she was giving that same affection to someone else, as if Michael didn't exist. The knife wasn't enough. He needed something that would send a message, something brutal, yet cold and calculated. His eyes drifted to the garage door. That's when the plan truly came together. Michael opened the door to the garage and flipped on the light. In the far corner sat his tool bench, covered in various implements from his years of fixing up the house, tools of precision, of craft. But tonight they were going to serve a darker purpose. He spotted the crowbar first. Heavy, solid steel. He picked it up, its weight comforting in his hands. It had been used to pry open stubborn floorboards when they renovated the house, but now it would pry apart the very life they had built. Next to it, hanging on the wall, was a roll of duct tape. He grabbed that too, tossing it on the workbench next to the crowbar. The thought of what came next filled him with a cold satisfaction. The man upstairs had no idea what was coming. Then Michael imagined the look on his face when he walked into the room, the terror that would spread as the reality of his situation sank in. But it wouldn't be quick. No, Michael would make sure it was slow, agonizing, and very, very real. Jennifer, though his wife, she wouldn't get off easy either. She was going to watch everything. Every second of the pain, every moment of fear. She was going to suffer for each lie, for each betrayal, for the way she had shattered their marriage over and over again. With his tools gathered, Michael headed back into the house, the crowbar's cold steel brushing against his leg with every step. The house was still eerily silent aside from the faint hum of the voices upstairs. The bedroom door was still ajar, a sliver of light spilling into the hallway. He paused just outside, staring at the crack in the door. His fingers tightened around the crowbar. This was it. No more waiting, no more planning. He wasn't going to knock. He wasn't going to announce himself. He was going to take back what was his. With a slow exhale, Michael pushed the door open, stepping inside with the calm of a man who had already made up his mind. Jennifer gasped, scrambling off the bed, while the man, her third lover, froze, eyes wide with fear. Michael smiled, a cold, dead smile. "Didn't expect me home early? Did you?" Michael's voice was calm, almost conversational, which made it all the more terrifying. He swung the crowbar casually, watching as their faces drained of color. The time for waiting was over. Now came the reckoning. Michael stood in the bedroom doorway, the crowbar hanging loosely from his hand, its dark steel glinting under the dim light. Jennifer, who had been sprawled across the bed with the stranger, shot up, clutching the sheet to her chest as if it could somehow shield her from what was coming. Her eyes were wide with shock, her mouth hanging open as she tried to form words. "Michael," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can explain." But there was nothing to explain. They both knew that. Michael didn't say a word. He didn't even glance at her. His gaze was fixed on the man sitting beside her, frozen in fear. The lover, Jennifer's third since she had vowed never to betray him again, looked like a deer caught in the headlights, too stunned to move. His shirt was half unbuttoned, his pants hastily pulled up. The realization that he was about to face something far worse than embarrassment had just begun to sink in. "Who the hell are you?" The man finally managed, his voice shaky, trying to muster up some false bravado. But Michael just stared at him with cold, dead eyes, the crowbar swinging slightly in his hand, almost casually. The lover scrambled off the bed, his bare feet hitting the floor with a thud as he backed up toward the wall. "Look, man, I didn't know she was married, okay?" His hands were raised, palms out in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "So this is all a mistake." Michael smirked. A mistake? His voice was low, almost too calm. He took a step forward, the weight of the crowbar heavy in his hand. You think this was a mistake? The lover's eyes flickered to Jennifer, then back to Michael, as if hoping she might come to his defense. But Jennifer was silent, her face pale, her body trembling. She knew better than to speak now. The last two men hadn't fared well. She had seen what Michael was capable of when pushed. But this time there was no warning in his voice, no pleading for answers or apologies. Just silence and that cold, unreadable expression that terrified her more than any raised voice ever could. Look, I'll leave, okay? The man stammered, trying to edge toward the door. This doesn't need to get ugly. But Michael moved faster. In one smooth motion, he stepped forward and swung the crowbar, catching the man's knee with a sickening crack. The lover screamed, collapsing to the floor, clutching his leg in agony. The sound of bone breaking echoed through the room, but Michael didn't flinch. He had heard it before. The first man had screamed just as loudly when Michael had broken his nose. The second had begged for mercy after a broken rib. Jennifer gasped, covering her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. "Michael, stop," she cried, finally finding her voice. "Please, don't do this." But he wasn't listening. He crouched down beside the man, who was writhing on the floor, clutching his shattered knee. Michael tilted his head, watching him with a clinical detachment, almost as if he were inspecting a damaged tool. The crowbar dripped with fresh blood, but he wasn't done. Not yet. "You came into my house," Michael said softly, his voice like ice. "You took what's mine. And now you think you can just walk out of here." The man whimpered, too consumed by pain to respond. Michael raised the crowbar again, watching as the man's eyes went wide with terror. Jennifer sobbed from the bed, her voice breaking. "Michael, please, you're going to kill him." Michael paused, turning his head slowly toward her. His expression softened, but only for a moment. "Oh, don't worry, I'm not going to kill him. But he's going to wish I had." Then, without another word, he brought the crowbar down again. The crowbar came down with brutal force, slamming into the man's ribcage with a sickening crunch. His scream was guttural, a raw sound that filled the room and seemed to vibrate through the walls. Jennifer's sobbing grew louder, but Michael was past caring about her tears. He watched the man writhe on the floor, his body convulsing in agony as he tried to crawl away, his hands clawing uselessly at the hardwood floor. "Stop, please," the man gasped between cries, blood trickling from his mouth. His eyes, once filled with confidence, now held nothing but fear and desperation. "I'm sorry, I didn't know. Michael crouched down beside him, gripping the crowbar tightly in his hand. The man recoiled, curling into himself as if that would stop what was coming. Michael's eyes were cold, his face devoid of any emotion. He didn't feel anger anymore, just the eye calm that came after a decision had been made. There was no going back. Not for him, not for Jennifer, and certainly not for this man. "You didn't know?" Michael's voice was low, almost a whisper, as he leaned in close to the man's ear. "You didn't know she was married? You didn't know she had a husband, a family?" The man whimpered, his breath hitching as he tried to nod, but Michael wasn't finished. When he grabbed the man by the collar of his shirt, yanking him up slightly before slamming him back down against the floor. "You came into my house," Michael continued, his voice as sharp as the crowbar he held. "And you thought you could just take what you wanted and leave? You thought there wouldn't be consequences." The man groaned, his face twisted in pain, his broken body trembling beneath Michael's grip. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come, only choked sobs and wheezes escaped his throat. Michael leaned back on his heels, breathing heavily, the weight of the crowbar suddenly feeling too familiar in his hands. This wasn't just about Jennifer anymore. This was about all but the years of lies, the betrayals, the way his life had slowly crumbled beneath the weight of her infidelities. And this man, this stranger, was just the final straw. Michael stood, turning to face Jennifer, who was still sobbing on the bed, her hands pressed against her mouth as if to stifle the sound. Her eyes were wide with horror, her face streaked with tears. She looked so small, so fragile as she stared at him in disbelief. "Michael, stop," she pleaded, her voice barely audible through her sobs. "Please, I'm sorry, I didn't mean for this to happen." Her words were empty, hollow, and Michael felt nothing as he looked at her. There had been a time when her tears might have softened him, when her apologies might have meant something. But not anymore. Not after everything she had done. "You didn't mean for this to happen," Michael repeated, his voice thick with contempt. He gestured toward the man, who was now lying in a pool of his own blood, gasping for breath. "This is what happens when you keep pushing, Jennifer. When you keep lying, keep cheating. This is what you wanted, isn't it?" She shook her head frantically, her tears falling faster now. "No, Michael, I didn't. I swear I love you. I didn't mean to hurt you." Michael laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that echoed in the room. Love? You call this love? He gestured toward the bed, toward the crumpled sheets where she had just been with another man. Do you think this is what love looks like? Jennifer sobbed harder, covering her face with her hands. I made a mistake. Please, Michael, we can fix this. Michael stared at her for a long moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Fix this? There was nothing left to fix. She had torn their marriage apart, piece by piece, with every affair, every lie. And now, standing in the wreckage of what used to be their life, all he could feel was a deep, bone-chilling numbness. No, Jennifer, he said quietly, his voice steady. There's no fixing this. Not anymore. Without another glance at her, Michael turned and walked out of the room, leaving Jennifer sobbing on the bed and the man bleeding on the floor. The silence that followed him was deafening. As Michael descended the stairs, leaving behind the chaos he'd just unleashed, a strange sense of calm settled over him. The house was eerily silent now, save for Jennifer's muffled sobs upstairs. Each step he took felt like a release, a shedding of the anger and betrayal that had consumed him for so long. The cold rage that had driven him up those stairs with the crowbar was fading, replaced by an unsettling emptiness. He reached the kitchen, pausing to set the blood-streaked crowbar on the counter. His hands were steady, but he could still feel the weight of the weapon, the vibrations of impact lingering in his muscles. The sight of it lying there, stained and heavy, brought a fleeting thought. What have I done? But the guilt was fleeting, barely more than a whisper, drowned out by the sense of finality that it had wrapped around his heart. But he grabbed a glass from the cupboard and poured himself a drink whiskey. Neat. The sharp burn as it slid down his throat was comforting in its simplicity. He needed clarity. He needed to think about what came next. There was no going back now. The line had been crossed, and Michael knew that whatever life he had with Jennifer was over, shattered into irreparable pieces. But it wasn't just about her anymore. No, this was about him, what he had become. He hadn't planned for it to end this way, hadn't imagined he'd be the man who would resort to violence. Yet here he was, staring at the reflection of a man he barely recognized in the darkened kitchen window. His own face seemed foreign, as if he were looking at a stranger, a man who had finally snapped. His phone buzzed on the counter, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at it, the screen lighting up with a message from a coworker, something about a meeting next week. It was surreal, the idea that outside this house, life continued as usual. People were planning their weekends, going about their routines, completely unaware that his world had just been torn apart upstairs. He swiped the message away, ignoring it, and took another sip of whiskey. The bitter taste was starting to numb him, dulling the edges of the storm brewing inside. The scene from upstairs replayed in his mind, the look of terror in the lover's eyes, Jennifer's desperate pleas, the crack of the crowbar against flesh and bone. The memory should have made him sick, but it didn't. It just felt inevitable. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence. Michael could hear faint movement from upstairs, probably Jennifer checking on her lover, trying to clean up the mess. She was always good at pretending, always quick to try and fix things after the damage had been done. But not this time. There was no coming back from this. He knew he couldn't stay here, not in this house, not with her. Every corner of this place was tainted now, a reminder of the lies, the betrayals, the violence. He needed to leave, to get away before the weight of it all became too much. Michael set the glass down and grabbed his car keys from the counter. The whiskey had calmed his shaking hands, but his mind was still racing, searching for the next move. Where would he go? He hadn't thought that far ahead. Maybe a hotel for the night, or maybe he'd just drive aimlessly, letting the road take him far away from this nightmare. As he reached for the front door, a final, muffled cry came from upstairs. Jennifer, begging again, pleading for something he no longer had to give. Love, forgiveness, redemption. But he paused, his hand on the doorknob, but didn't turn back. There was nothing left for him here. Without a word, Michael stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind him. The cool night air hit his face like a slap, but it was a welcome shock. He was free now, but what kind of freedom? It was dark, cold, and stained with blood. He wasn't sure. All he knew was that he was done. Done with Jennifer. Done with everything. Michael walked to his car, the weight of the past few hours pressing down on him like a lead blanket. As the engine roared to life and the headlights cut through the night, he didn't look back. The car sped down the empty suburban streets, the engine's hum the only sound breaking the stillness of the night. Michael gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, but his mind felt oddly detached, as if he were floating above himself, watching it all from a distance. The whiskey buzzed lightly in his veins, but it wasn't enough to numb the chaos swirling inside him. He had left the house behind, left them behind, the wreckage of what used to be his life, now just a dim memory in the rearview mirror. But he didn't have a destination in mind, didn't care where he was going, The road stretched out before him like a blank canvas, and for the first time in a long time, he felt truly untethered. No job, no wife, no obligations, just the open road and the weight of his choices. But that weight pressed down harder with every mile, creeping up his spine like a cold hand reminding him of what he'd done. His mind flashed back to Jennifer's face, her tear-streaked cheeks, the shock in her eyes as she realized he had changed, that he wasn't going to beg for her love or forgiveness anymore. He was done playing the fool, done pretending that things could ever go back to normal. And that man, the third lover, Michael could still hear his pathetic groans, see the blood pooling around him on the bedroom floor. He had wanted to do more, to crush the man entirely, but something had stopped him. Maybe it was the realization that no amount of violence could truly undo what had been done. Or maybe, deep down, Michael knew he wasn't a killer. At least not yet. The thought twisted in his mind as he took a sharp turn, the tires squealing slightly on the pavement. His grip on the wheel tightened as he tried to push the thought away. He had crossed lines tonight, but there were still places he hadn't gone, still limits, even in his fury. But for how long? The question gnawed at him, sinking its claws deeper with each passing second. He needed to clear his head, needed space to think. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the outline of a gas station up ahead. Michael pulled into the lot, the bright fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows over the empty pumps. He parked by the convenience store and sat there for a moment, staring blankly at the neon open sign flickering in the window. For the first time since leaving the house, he felt the weight of exhaustion settle into his bones. His body was heavy, drained from the adrenaline that had fueled his rage. He leaned back in the seat, closing his eyes, letting the hum of the engine soothe him for a moment. But his mind wouldn't stop. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Jennifer's face, the way she had looked at him, a mixture of fear and regret. But what haunted him more was the look of indifference she'd had before he'd burst into the room. She hadn't cared. Not really. She had moved on from him long before he'd ever confronted her. Michael clenched his jaw, trying to block out the images, but they came rushing back, her laughter with another man, the ease with which she had tossed aside their life together, their history. He had always prided himself on being calm, rational, the type of man who could handle anything life threw at him. But this had broken something inside him. The door to the gas station swung open, and a young couple emerged, laughing softly as they carried a bag of snacks to their car. Michael watched them for a moment, his heart tightening with something like envy. They looked carefree, unburdened by the kind of betrayal that had torn his life apart. He wondered if they would ever end up like him, broken, furious, alone in the middle of the night with nothing but regret to keep them company. The thought made him sick, and he shoved the door open, stepping out into the cool night air. The breeze hit his face, clearing some of the fog from his mind. He needed to keep moving, to get away from everything that reminded him of the life he'd just destroyed. As he stood there, staring at the highway stretching out before him, Michael felt the crushing weight of uncertainty settle over him. He had left, but where was he going? And more importantly, who was he now? Michael stood outside the gas station, the cool night air biting at his skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was too tangled in the events of the night, the weight of what he had done pressing down harder with every passing second. The crowbar, the blood, the screams had all played in his head on a loop, like a nightmare he couldn't escape. He had gotten in his car and driven, leaving behind the wreckage of his life, but now he wasn't sure where to go or what came next. The young couple he had seen earlier were pulling out of the parking lot, their laughter carried on the wind as they drove off into the night. And Michael watched them disappear, feeling the emptiness inside him grow. Once upon a time, he had been like them, happy, carefree, thinking the future was something bright and full of promise. But now that future had been ripped away, torn apart by betrayal and rage, what was left? The car was still running, the engine purring softly in the quiet of the empty gas station. As he took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. There was no point in staying here, no reason to linger in the cold light of the station. He needed to go to find somewhere to clear his head. But where? Home wasn't an option anymore, not after what he'd done. The house was tainted, a monument to everything that had gone wrong. Michael walked back to the car and slid into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as he stared out at the dark road ahead. So the silence in the car was suffocating, pressing down on him until he couldn't stand it anymore. He turned on the radio, letting the soft hum of static fill the void. But it didn't help. Nothing could drown out the thoughts racing through his mind. His phone buzzed in the cup holder, pulling him back to reality. He glanced down, seeing Jennifer's name flash across the screen. She was calling him. Of course she was. She must have realized by now that he wasn't coming back, that whatever remained of their life together was gone. For a moment, he considered answering, imagining her sobbing on the other end of the line, begging for forgiveness or trying to explain her way out of this mess. But Michael couldn't bring himself to pick up. There was nothing left to say. He let the phone buzz until it stopped, leaving the car in silence once more. His hands were trembling now, and he couldn't tell if it was from the adrenaline or the cold emptiness gnawing at his insides. He hit the gas, pulling out of the parking lot and back onto the highway. The road stretched out before him, an endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through the darkness. It felt like a metaphor for his life, now directionless, uncertain, with no clear destination in sight. As he drove, his mind wandered back to the years he had spent with Jennifer. The early days when everything seemed perfect. He remembered the laughter, the small moments that had made their life together feel full of promise. They had been happy once, or at least he had thought they were. But now, looking back, he wondered if it had all been a lie. How long had Jennifer been unfaithful? Had he just been too blind to see it? Too trusting? That thought gnawed at him, a bitter taste in the back of his throat. He had loved her. He had built a life with her, believed in their future. And she had thrown it all away. For what? For a string of meaningless affairs with men who weren't him. Michael's grip tightened on the wheel as the anger surged back. He had given her everything, and she had repaid him with lies and betrayal. He wasn't sure what hurt more, the fact that she had cheated, or the fact that he had let it happen, not once, but 3 times. The road blurred in front of him as he pushed the car faster, the needle climbing higher on the speedometer. But he didn't know where he was going, but in that moment, it didn't matter. All he wanted was to escape, to outrun the pain, the anger, the memories that haunted him. But deep down, he knew there was no outrunning this. No matter how far he drove, the damage was done. The Michael drove for hours, letting the hum of the engine and the blur of the highway swallow his thoughts. He hadn't spoken a word since he left the gas station, hadn't answered his phone as it buzzed over and over in the cup holder, each call from Jennifer more frantic than the last. He was numb now, the initial fury that had fueled his actions fading into something darker, something hollow. The night seemed endless, the road stretching ahead of him like a black ribbon, leading nowhere. He was on autopilot, just driving for the sake of it, as if the motion itself could keep him from thinking too much, from facing the reality of what he had done. But no matter how far he went, he couldn't escape the images flashing in his mind, the blood on the floor, the sound of the crowbar striking flesh, the look of horror on Jennifer's face. So he tried to tell himself it was justified. She had betrayed him again and again, tearing apart their marriage with every affair, every lie. He had given her chances, too many chances. And yet, despite everything, the regret was beginning to creep in, slithering through the cracks of his rage. Not regret for hurting her lover, that man had deserved every blow, but regret for what it all meant. That it had come to this. That his life had spiraled so far out of control that violence seemed like the only answer. Michael's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of his own reflection in the dim light. He barely recognized the man staring back at him, his face gaunt, eyes shadowed with exhaustion and something darker. He looked like a man who had lost everything, a man who had crossed lines he could never uncross. The phone buzzed again, snapping him back to the present. This time it wasn't a call. It was a text. He hesitated, then glanced down at the screen. It wasn't Jennifer this time. It was from his sister, Claire. "So Mike, where are you?" Jen called me. "She's worried sick." Said, "You left. Are you okay?" Worried sick. Michael laughed bitterly at that, the sound hollow in the quiet car. Of course Jennifer was worried. She probably thought he was going to come back and finish the job, or worse, she feared what he might do to himself. But he wasn't planning on going back. Not to her, not to that house, that life was over, shattered into pieces he had no interest in picking up. He stared at the message for a long moment, then tossed the phone onto the passenger seat without replying. He couldn't deal with Claire right now. She couldn't know what had happened tonight. She would try to fix things, to tell him that it wasn't too late, that he could still turn around and make things right. But Michael knew better. Some things were beyond fixing. The road was getting emptier now, the houses and streetlights disappearing as the highway stretched into open country. He was heading out of the city, further and further from the life he had known. Maybe that was what he wanted, to get lost, to disappear somewhere no one could find him. But even as that thought crossed his mind, he knew it wasn't possible. You couldn't outrun your past, no matter how fast you drove. The weight of his actions was with him now, a constant shadow, and it would follow him wherever he went. He slowed the car down, pulling off onto the shoulder of the road, the engine ticking softly as he killed the ignition. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing down on him with the full force of everything he had been trying to avoid. He sat there for a long time, staring out into the darkness, the vast emptiness of the countryside stretching before him like a reflection of the emptiness inside him. For the first time that night, Michael allowed himself to truly feel it, the grief, the loss, the weight of what he had become. He wasn't just a man who had been betrayed. He was a man who had let that betrayal consume him, turned him into something cold, something brutal. He had lost more than just his marriage tonight. He had lost himself. And now, sitting alone on the side of a deserted road, he wasn't sure if he would ever find his way back. Michael sat in the stillness of his car, parked on the side of the empty road, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The vast stretch of the countryside was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. It was a kind of silence that should have been peaceful, but instead, it felt suffocating, as if the night itself was closing in on him, demanding that he confront everything he had been running from. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against the steering wheel, his breath coming in slow, ragged exhales. The events of the night played over and over in his mind, like a broken film reel Jennifer's betrayal. The violence, the blood, the wreckage of everything they had built together. He had left it all behind, but the weight of it clung to him, an inescapable shadow. For the first time, the full scope of what he had done hit him like a tidal wave. He had crossed a line, not just with Jennifer, her lover, but within himself. The rage had consumed him, turned him into something monstrous, something he hadn't known he was capable of being. There was no coming back from that. No undoing the damage. His phone buzzed again from the passenger seat, but this time he didn't even glance at it. He knew it was more messages, probably from Jennifer, maybe even from his sister Claire, who had likely heard bits and pieces of the story by now. So what could he say? How could he explain any of this to them, to anyone? He couldn't even explain it to himself. Michael lifted his head, staring out into the darkness. He had always been a man who prided himself on control of his emotions, control of his life, and he had built everything carefully, brick by brick, believing that his steady hand could guide him through anything. But tonight had shattered that illusion. He had lost control in the worst possible way, and now, sitting here alone, he realized just how far he had fallen. His thoughts wandered back to Jennifer, her face streaked with tears, her voice breaking as she begged him to stop. A part of him had wanted to hurt her, to make her feel the same kind of pain she had inflicted on him over and over again. But now, in the cold aftermath of his rage, all he felt was hollow. The satisfaction he had expected never came. The revenge hadn't healed him, it had only broken him further. He didn't know where to go from here. The road stretched out before him, leading to nothing, just as his life now seemed to stretch into a future he couldn't grasp. So there was no redemption waiting for him at the end of this drive, no forgiveness that could undo the violence he had unleashed. He was a man without direction, without purpose. For a moment, Michael thought about just driving, not stopping until he reached some distant town where no one knew his name, where he could start over. But he knew deep down that running wasn't the answer. He couldn't escape what he had done, no matter how far he went. To guilt, the regret, they would follow him, haunt him, just as surely as the memory of that blood-stained crowbar. He looked at his hands, his fingers still trembling slightly, as if the adrenaline from earlier had never fully left his system. These hands had once built a life, cared for his wife, held her when she was afraid, and tonight they had destroyed something that could never be repaired. The phone buzzed again, breaking the silence, but this time it wasn't Jennifer. It was Claire. He stared at the screen for a moment, debating whether to pick up, his thumb hovering over the answer button. She wouldn't understand. How could she? Claire had always been the stable one, the one who believed in forgiveness, in family, in second chances. But this wasn't something that could be forgiven. Not by her, not by Jennifer, not even by himself. Michael finally picked up the phone, his voice rough and broken. Claire. There was silence on the other end for a moment, and then her voice came through, soft and filled with concern. Michael, where are you? Please tell me you're okay. He didn't answer right away. He wasn't okay. He wasn't sure he ever would be again. But maybe this was the first step acknowledging that, facing it instead of trying to outrun it. I don't know, he whispered, the weight of his actions pressing down harder than ever. I don't know where I am. I don't know what to do. Claire's voice was steady, calming. Just come home, Mike. We'll figure this out. We'll get through it. But as her words echoed in his ear, Michael knew the truth. He had gone too far. There was no home to go back to. Not anymore. He hung up the phone, dropped it onto the seat, and stared out into the darkness.